The ferry, a squat, rust-streaked vessel named the Solace, cleaved through the slate-gray water with a rhythmic shudder that vibrated up Dean's spine. Around him, the sea was a churning expanse of whitecaps, each crest momentarily catching the pale light before dissolving into foam. A thick, saline mist clung to the air, tasting of brine and something else, something metallic and ancient, like cold stone dragged from the ocean floor. Dean gripped the worn railing, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the disappearing mainland, then turning toward the indistinct smudge on the horizon that was his new, solitary home. He had come to this place, this remote island, not by choice, but by obligation and a desperate yearning for oblivion. The solicitor's clipped tones still echoed in his memory, detailing the unexpected inheritance, a desolate lighthouse keeper's cottage, a relic from an estranged grandfather he barely knew. It was a final, ironic gift from a man whose life had been as isolated as Dean's now felt. The cartographer in him, usually so precise and ordered, had found no map for the grief that had swallowed his world whole, leaving only a hollow ache where purpose once resided. He needed a place where the world couldn't reach him, a place where the silence might finally allow him to hear himself think again, or perhaps to simply stop thinking altogether. As the Solace rounded a craggy headland, the fog, which had been a distant haze, now descended, swallowing the horizon whole. Through the swirling gray, Dean caught a fleeting glimpse of structures on a distant, northern promontory. Low, squat buildings of weathered concrete, partially obscured by the mist. A faded, peeling sign, barely decipherable through the gloom, read research station. It seemed abandoned, a silent testament to some forgotten human endeavor, adding another layer to the island's already heady cloak of desolation. He wondered what kind of research had once been conducted in such an isolated, unforgiving place. The ferryman, a gaunt, taciturn individual with eyes like chips of flint, merely grunted as Dean disembarked onto the small, barnacle-encrusted dock. No welcoming committee, no curious glances, just the relentless sigh of the wind and the distant, mournful cry of gulls. A narrow, overgrown track, barely more than a sheep path, snaked its way up from the dock and disappeared into a dense thicket of wind-stunted pines. This was his road. He adjusted the strap of his bag, the weight a comforting anchor against the lightness of his own being, and began to climb. The path was uneven, strewn with loose pebbles and slick moss, forcing him to watch his footing. The vegetation pressed in, clawing at his trousers, the branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. He pushed through, his breath missing in the frigid air, the only sound the crunch of his boots and the distant roar of the ocean. After what felt like an hour of relentless ascent, the trees abruptly gave way to a wind-swept plateau. There it was, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It stood alone, a solitary sentinel perched precariously close to the cliff edge, its whitewashed walls stained with grime and salt, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. A shingle of slate had slipped from the cottage roof, leaving a gaping wound, and the front door, made of thick, weathered oak, sagged on its hinges. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Dean approached slowly, the wind whipping at his coat, carrying with it a distinct, earthy smell. Not just damp soil, but something deeper, richer, like freshly turned grave dirt mixed with the tang of the sea. The lock groaned in protest as he turned it, a metallic shriek that echoed unnervingly in the sudden quiet that followed. He stepped over the threshold, his boots stirring up decades of settled grime. The light from the open doorway struggled to penetrate the gloom, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. He fumbled for the switch beside the door, but nothing happened. Of course, no power. He set down his bags and rummaged for the hurricane lamp and matches he'd packed. The furniture, what little there was shrouded in white sheets, ghostly forms in the dim light. A thin film of dust coated every surface, a testament to the passage of time and the absence of life. Dean moved deeper into the cottage, the lamp held high. A faint, almost imperceptible thrumming vibrated through the floorboards, a low, resonant hum that he first attributed to the wind rattling the house. But it felt deeper, more internal, like a pulse beneath the earth. He paused, listening intently. The sound seemed to recede, then returned, a faint, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the cottage. He walked to the single window, pulling back a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. The glass was opaque with salt spray, but through a clearer patch he could see the churning gray of the sea, endless and unforgiving. It was then, as he stood there, watching the waves break against the cliffs, that he heard it. It wasn't the howl of the wind, nor the creak of settling timber. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, or perhaps something less natural, a voice barely audible, just beyond the edge of human hearing. Not that he was tired, profoundly so, and this isolated place was already getting to him. He was determined, though. He had nowhere else to go. The ferryman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, offered Dean a curt nod as the gangplank thudded onto the slick wooden dock. Dean hoisted his duffel bag higher on his shoulder, the weight a familiar anchor against the swirling uncertainty in his gut. The island's shore was a jagged line of gray rock disappearing into the omnipresent fog, which now swirled around his ankles like a restless spirit. He followed a winding, overgrown path, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound besides the distant moan of a foghorn. The cottage, when it finally emerged from the mist, was exactly as he'd pictured, squat, stone-built, and defiant against the elements. Its windows, dark and vacant, stared out at the sea with a kind of blind resignation. This was it. Solitude, a chance to map a new life, away from the devastating coordinates of his past. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of aged wood, salt, and something subtly metallic, like old coins. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy panes. He dropped his bag and walked to the front window, peering out at the water. The tide, he noted, seemed unusually high, gnawing at the very edge of the rocky foreshore, closer than he would have expected for this time of day. He pulled out his tide tables, a habit ingrained from years of coastal cartography. His brow furrowed. The water level was at least a foot above the predicted mark, and its ebb and flow seemed off, a sluggish, uneven pulse rather than the steady rhythm he knew. He dismissed it as an anomaly, perhaps an unusual current or a minor storm surge he hadn't heard about. The island was remote after all. The wind began to pick up, whining through the eaves, a mournful, relentless sound. But beneath the whistle of the gale, something else began to intrude, faint at first, like the sigh of distant waves, but then it seemed to shift, coalesce. He paused, holding his breath, straining to hear over the storm. Indistinct, guttural, carried on the very currents of the air. He tried to pinpoint them, moving from window to window, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, swirling in the fog just beyond the cottage walls. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. The roar of the surf, the creak of the old house, the isolation playing tricks on his ears. He gripped the sill, his knuckles white. It was just the wind, he told himself, nothing more. He spent the next hour methodically unpacking, trying to impose order on the chaos of the empty cottage and his own frayed nerves. He found a small, locked chest tucked away in a dusty corner of the grandfather's study. A heavy, tarnished brass key, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, opened it with a reluctant click. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed charts and navigation tools, lay a leather-bound journal. It was thick, its cover warped and stained, smelling faintly of brine and mildew. Many of its pages were water-damaged, the ink bled into illegible smears, but others remained remarkably preserved. Dean carefully opened it. The handwriting was his grandfather's, precise yet frantic in places. He flipped through the early entries, mundane observations about weather patterns and lighthouse maintenance, then the tone began to shift. The deep song. Dean's eyes scanned for more. They hear it, and it hears them. His grandfather had been a solitary figure, prone to eccentricity. He thought of the unusual tides he'd observed, the strange guttural murmurs on the wind. Coincidence! All of it! He walked back to the window, the journal clutched in his hand. The fog had thinned momentarily, revealing a sliver of the horizon. Far off, almost imperceptible through the lingering haze, he saw a faint, intermittent light blinking. He knew it to be the light from the small, rarely manned research station on the island's opposite side. A scientific outpost, a bastion of logic and observation. Perhaps, he thought, someone there could offer a rational explanation for the strange tidal patterns, for the peculiar atmospheric conditions that might be playing tricks on his ears. The thought brought a sliver of comfort, a thread of reason to cling to amidst the growing unease. He tightened his grip on the journal, its unsettling contents feeling heavier in his hands. He was determined to find answers, to map out the reality of this island even if it meant confronting the unsettling legacy his grandfather had left behind. The cold dread that had begun to coil in Dean's stomach had not dissipated with the morning light. He had tried, truly, to dismiss the sketches as the ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation, a mind frayed by the relentless roar of the ocean. Yet, the images, crude but visceral, had burrowed into his mind. Tentacles, eyes like abyssal pits, a gaping maw. They felt too specific for mere metaphor, too chillingly drawn from something seen, not imagined. He needed answers, or at least a firm debunking. The cottage offered little beyond the journal, but Dean remembered a small, dilapidated research station tucked away on the island's northern tip. It was where his grandfather occasionally referenced finding old charts or obscure texts. The research station stood like a skeletal sentinel against the gray sky, its paint peeling, windows opaque with salt spray and grime. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing an interior choked with dust and the scent of mildewed paper. Shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten volumes, their spines cracked, pages yellowed. A single, grimy desk was buried beneath stacks of maps, geological surveys, and what looked like ethnological studies of the region. Dean ran a hand over a thick layer of dust, the fine particles clinging to his skin. He began to sift through the chaos, his fingers growing grimy. He found reports on the island's unique geology, tidal patterns, and a surprising number of references to local folklore. Its pages, brittle as autumn leaves, spoke of ancient fishing communities, their reliance on the sea, and their peculiar reverence for its depths. He read of a lost city, submerged beneath the churning waves, a place of cyclopean architecture and strange, phosphorescent flora. The old texts hinted at an entity dwelling within, an ancient guardian or perhaps a slumbering god, whose presence ensured bountiful catches but demanded an unspoken tribute. There were mentions of the offering, the pact, and the deep's embrace. The language was archaic, veiled in superstition, but the echoes were undeniable. He remembered his grandfather's frantic scrawls about the rising tide and the payment due. Could it be that the old man hadn't been delusional, but terrified? Back in the cottage, the journal lay open on the desk, waiting. With the knowledge gleaned from the research station, the cryptic entries shifted from nonsensical ramblings to a harrowing narrative. The pact was broken. One entry, read, "They stopped the offering. Now the song grows louder." Another, "It demands payment. A soul for a bounty. The deep remembers its due." Dean's breath hitched. His grandfather's final, desperate plea about the deep song and the rising entity wasn't just fear, it was a warning. A warning Dean had ignored. That night, the dreams began. He found himself not in his bed, but adrift in an endless, inky blackness. It was the deep song. He felt himself sinking, the pressure building, his lungs screaming for air he couldn't find. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, the phantom pressure still crushing his chest. Dean swung his legs out of bed, his mind still reeling from the dream's vivid horror. He moved to the small wash basin, intending to splash cold water on his face when he noticed it. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the porcelain. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed. Tiny, iridescent strands, like microscopic emerald threads, pulsed with a soft, otherworldly light. Bioluminescent algae, it clung to the basin's rim, traced the faint cracks in the ceramic, and even seemed to be spreading in a thin film across the water's surface. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He hadn't seen anything like it yesterday. He walked into the small kitchen. There, on the wooden floorboards near the threshold, was another patch, a faint, greenish luminescence in the dim light, tracing an intricate, almost symbolic pattern. The rational explanations were crumbling. The island's legends, his grandfather's desperate journal, the terrifying dreams, and now, this impossible, glowing growth. The deep song wasn't just a metaphor, it was real, and it was here. Dean, despite the gnawing unease, was determined to find a rational explanation, a tangible anchor in the swirling chaos of the island. He spent the morning methodically, almost obsessively, cleaning the cottage, hoping that imposing order on the physical space might quell the disorder in his mind. He dusted the heavy oak furniture, swept the gritty floorboards, and organized stacks of mildewed books. It was during this task that he first noticed the hum. He paused, a rag frozen in his hand, listening. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the very bones of the old house. He shook his head, dismissing it as the wind rattling the ancient foundations, or perhaps the creaking strain of the lighthouse mechanism. The cottage was old, after all, and prone to peculiar noises. Later, while making a cup of tea, he set his mug on the small, chipped kitchen table. He turned to retrieve a biscuit from a tin on the counter. A soft, muffled thud echoed behind him. He spun around. He hadn't touched it. It had simply slid. His breath hitched. He stared at the broken pieces, then at the table, then back at the mug. No tremor, no bump, no logical reason. He knelt, heart hammering against his ribs, and began to pick up the shards. His fingers trembled. He told himself it was just a loose floorboard, a slight tilt in the table, an old house settling. It vibrated in his teeth, in the soles of his feet. He felt it more than heard it. For a split second, the image rippled, distorting. He blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his own pale, strained face staring back. A trick of the light, he thought, his stomach clenching. The fog outside, the poor visibility, the relentless exhaustion. Driven by a sudden, desperate need for answers, Dean returned to his grandfather's study, a room he had previously only glanced at. He began to search with a new intensity, pulling out drawers, tapping along the walls, feeling beneath the loose floorboards. Inside, nestled among brittle, yellowed papers, was a small, crudely carved wooden idol. Next to it lay a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his grandfather's hurried, almost frantic script. Dean's eyes scanned the entries, the words blurring into a nightmare. The pact demands its due offerings must be made to keep the depths at bay. There were drawings, too, not unlike the ones in the sketchpad, but these were interspersed with crude maps of the island, X's marking various points. One location was circled repeatedly, the abandoned research station on the island's northernmost point. His grandfather had clearly been trying to ward something off, perhaps even appease it. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through Dean. His grandfather hadn't just been isolated, he had been fighting something. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate directly in his chest. Dean felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to move, to go somewhere, to do something. He looked up from the journal, his gaze drawn to the study door. A shimmer, like heat haze over asphalt, pulsed in the gloom. Then, a distinct form began to emerge, not solid, not liquid, but a shifting, aqueous outline. It was vaguely humanoid, taller than a man, its edges blurring and reforming as if made of churning water. It drifted towards him, silent, impossibly swift. Dean froze, the journal falling from his numb fingers. He couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Dean recoiled, stumbling backwards, overturning his grandfather's chair with a clatter. Dean scrambled away, pressing himself against the far wall, gasping for air that felt thick and heavy. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his imagination. It had been real, and it had been here asterisk. The hum was a roar in his ears now, a relentless thrum that echoed the terrifying beat of his own blood. Dean was no longer just a man seeking solitude. He was a man trapped, and something ancient had finally stirred from its long slumber, its presence now an undeniable, suffocating reality. He sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before him, flanked by his own maps and navigational charts. The air in the cottage felt heavy, not just with the dampness of the island, but with a palpable pressure, a low thrum that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the structure. He tried to focus on the faded ink, the looping script that had once been so familiar. His grandfather's writing, once neat and precise, had deteriorated into a frantic tangle of words and symbols in the later pages. Dean traced a finger over a particularly elaborate drawing, not of the lighthouse, nor the island's jagged coastline, but of a sprawling, multi-limbed thing, all sinew and bone, writhing amidst stylized waves. Beside it, a series of notes detailed the deep song, not just as a sound, but as a vibration, a frequency that could unmoor the mind. He remembered the strange, almost imperceptible hum that had started in the lighthouse, a low resonance he dismissed as the wind. Now he felt it again, a subtle tremor in the floorboards, a pressure behind his eyes. He flipped pages, searching for a pattern, a key. The earlier entries were observations, weather patterns, unusual marine life, strange light phenomena far out at sea. But gradually, the tone shifted. There were references to the keeping, the pact, and the balance. His grandfather wasn't just observing, he was actively involved, a keeper of more than just the light. One passage, underlined multiple times, caught Dean's eye. The station holds the key to the frequency. Its instruments, though crude, measured the resonance. The old one stirs when the song is lost. The research station. Dean remembered seeing its abandoned skeleton on his cartographic surveys of the island, a cluster of rusting corrugated iron shacks a few miles inland, half swallowed by gorse and seagrass. He'd assumed it was a forgotten weather outpost. Now, a cold prickle traced its way up his spine. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper. He'd been a custodian of something far older, far more dangerous. The hum in the cottage intensified, morphing into a low, mournful drone that seemed to pull at the edges of his concentration. Dean squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, pressing his palms to his temples. He opened his eyes. He was tired, he told himself. The isolation, the lack of sleep, the stress. And that was all it was. But the journal wouldn't let him dismiss it. It was a partial schematic of the lighthouse's foundation, annotated with cryptic symbols and measurements. A dotted line led to a section marked crypt. Beneath it, a single, stark entry. The pulse must be maintained. The blood-bound earth, the heart of the keeping. Dean felt a knot tighten in his gut. Blood-bound earth? What ritual had his grandfather been performing? And what did it mean? The song is lost. Had Dean's arrival, his disruption of the old man's routine, somehow broken whatever delicate balance his grandfather had maintained? He felt a dizzying disorientation, a strange sense that the walls of the cottage were breathing, the very air around him thickening. He had to go to the research station. He needed to understand what his grandfather meant by the frequency. Clutching the journal, Dean pushed himself up from the table. The fog had rolled in thick, muffling the world, turning the familiar path into a gray, indistinct tunnel. The deeper he walked, the more pervasive the deep song became. A low, guttural moan that seemed to a man emanate from beneath the very earth. It wasn't just in his ears now, it was in his bones, vibrating through his teeth, making his muscles ache. The research station was a cluster of 3 dilapidated shacks, their windows long since shattered, their corrugated iron walls pitted with rust. The wind whistled through the gaps, creating an eerie chorus that mingled with the omnipresent drone. Broken instruments lay scattered on rotting workbenches, rusted dials, snapped wires, a shattered seismograph. Most of the entries were illegible, but one legible line stood out, dated decades ago. Anomalous seismic activity, frequency 1.7 Hz. Unprecedented resonance detected from beneath the island. 1.7 Hz. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon. His grandfather hadn't been mad. He had been fighting something, and Dean had inherited the battle. He didn't find the key his grandfather mentioned, but the confirmation of the station's purpose, the specific frequency, hammered home the reality of the threat. His grandfather's journal wasn't just a diary, it was a desperate guide. He stumbled back to the lighthouse, the drone now a roaring torrent in his mind. He ignored the cottage, heading straight for the lighthouse base. He descended the winding metal stairs to the ground floor, the thrumming growing exponentially louder, vibrating through the stone walls. The map pointed to a section obscured by a stack of old rope coils and discarded buoys. He shoved them aside, revealing a section of wall that looked subtly different. The mortar lines were tighter, the stones slightly larger. He pressed against the stones, feeling for a seam, a catch. The deep song pulsed, a relentless pressure against his eardrums, blurring his vision. His fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation, a slight recess. He pushed. A gust of stagnant, heavy air smelling of damp earth and something indefinably ancient seeped out. This was it, the crypt, the heart of the keeping. And Dean, with a terrible, dawning understanding, knew he had just opened the door. Dean felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill deeper than the island's perpetual damp. His grandfather hadn't just been battling an obsession. He'd been fighting for his sanity, perhaps for his very soul. The 1.7 Hz frequency, a silent hum of malevolence, echoed in Dean's mind, pulling his back to the research station like a moth to a strange, dark flame. He had inherited more than a crumbling cottage. He'd inherited a war, and the first battleground was clear. The wind howled its usual lament around the corrugated metal shell of the research station, but Dean barely registered it. He pushed the heavy door open, the groan of protesting hinges a familiar sound in the desolate quiet. Inside, the air was still, thick with the scent of brine, ozone, and something else, a faint metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. He went directly to the room where the frequency had been strongest, where his grandfather's desperate scrawls covered every surface. His gaze swept over the cluttered space, seeking a discontinuity, a break in the pattern. The key his grandfather had written. What key? Not a physical one. Dean now understood. A key to understanding, perhaps, or a key to unlock a hidden truth. He remembered a faint tremor, a resonance when the frequency had peaked. He pushed against the cabinet, grunting with effort as the heavy metal scraped against the floor, revealing a section of wall that seemed different. A hairline crack, almost invisible, spiderwebbed across the concrete, outlining a rectangular section. No handle, no obvious latch. Dean pressed his palm against the surface. He remembered his grandfather's journals, the cryptic notes about specific frequencies, about resonance. Dean knelt, pulling a small, portable audio frequency generator from his bag. His grandfather had left it behind, a crude but functional device. Dean adjusted the dial slowly, methodically, pushing the frequency higher, then lower, listening intently. He held it there, his breath catching in his throat. A low, grinding sound, like stone on stone, echoed from within the wall. The rectangular section recessed inward, slowly, inexorably, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. A cramped, descending passage, roughly hewn, stretched into the black. He retrieved a powerful headlamp from his bag, securing it to his forehead. Water dripped somewhere unseen. A rhythmic plink 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 that seemed to count down to something terrible. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. Dean's headlamp beam struggled to pierce the immensity. The walls here were not concrete, but raw, glistening rock, slick with moisture. In the center of the chamber, suspended above a pool of unnaturally still, Inkai water, was the source of the subtle thrumming. It was an object unlike anything Bean had ever conceived. Not metal, not stone, but something that seemed to absorb the light, a pulsating core of obsidian blackness, roughly spherical, yet constantly shifting its contours as if breathing. Veins of phosphorescent blue, like frozen lightning, pulsed beneath its surface, illuminating faint, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and coil. It hummed, a low, guttural vibration that resonated not just in the air, but directly within Dean's skull, bypassing his ears entirely. This was no ordinary artifact. This was a focal point, a conduit. As Dean stared, mesmerized and horrified, the hum intensified, vibrating through the very marrow of his bones. The air grew thick, shimmering with unseen energy. The blue veins on the artifact pulsed faster, brighter, and the surface of the water below began to churn, not with waves, but with a slow, viscous undulation, as if something vast was stirring beneath. Then, the vision hit him. It wasn't a hallucination, not precisely. It was an invasion, a torrent of pure, unadulterated sensation. He saw the island, not as it was, but as it would be. The lighthouse fractured and crumbling, its light extinguished. He saw himself, or what remained of him, a consciousness adrift in that crushing blackness, his memories dissolving, his identity unraveling, becoming part of the vast, silent, hungry entity. The entity's nature was not alien in the sense of outer space, but profoundly, terrifyingly other. It was ancient, primordial, a consciousness that had existed before the concept of time, before the shaping of the world. It wasn't just in the deep, it was the deep, and it wanted to reclaim the island, Dean, everything. He stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The vision receding, but its icy tendrils still clutching his mind. The hum of the artifact continued, a relentless promise. This wasn't just a secret, it was an active threat, an encroaching reality. His grandfather hadn't been mad. He'd been trying to warn everyone. And now, Dean knew. The battle wasn't just inherited, it had begun. He stood in the cottage, small study, the grandfather's journal clutched in hands that felt alien, his own skin suddenly too loose, too porous. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against his eardrums, making the very notion of sound feel like a physical assault. The walls of the cottage, once a comforting shield against the world, now seemed to breathe, their weathered planks expanding and contracting with a faint, wet sigh. Shadows stretched and writhed in the corners, no longer mere absences of light, but something alive, hungry. He wasn't just observing, he was being observed. He stumbled back, colliding with the heavy oak desk, sending the grandfather's forgotten pipe clattering to the floor. The whisper intensified, a dull, aching throb behind his eyes, a sensation of being stretched thin, of his consciousness being pulled taut, ready to snap. It wanted in. He wasn't just being tormented, he was being grieved. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the 1.7 Hz frequency resonated deeper than bone, a bass note that vibrated his very teeth. He could feel it in his marrow, a dull, resonant ache that promised to shatter him from the inside out. This wasn't just a mental attack. It was a physical invasion, a slow, horrifying possession of his reality. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted to the journal. There had to be an answer. His grandfather, for all his madness, had chronicled this horror. He tore through the pages, his fingers fumbling, desperate. The familiar script blurred, then sharpened as he found a section marked with a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. Dean remembered his grandfather mentioning it, a place of isolated study, a final desperate effort. A shiver ran down his spine. The old man had known. He had been trying to stop it. He continued to read, his eyes devouring the words, his mind racing to grasp the fragmented logic. The 1.7 Hz frequency wasn't just a signal, it was the entity's signature, its very presence vibrating at a frequency that weakened the barriers between worlds. The journal described a method, not a ritual in the traditional sense, but a complex series of resonant frequencies and specific materials, all intended to create a counter-frequency, a dissonant chord that would close the gateway. But the instructions were incomplete, fragmented, scattered amongst pages of increasingly erratic ramblings. He saw diagrams he couldn't decipher, symbols that pulsed with a malevolent energy on the page, almost seeming to shift before his eyes. Then he found it. It wasn't about the mechanics of the seal, but its cost. The price it cannot be of this world at peace, unbound a tether severed. The equilibrium demands a sacrifice of self to anchor the world, the perception, the connection to become the threshold to bear witness eternally. Dean's breath hitched. A sacrifice of self, not blood, not a life, but something far more insidious, more terrifying. To become the threshold, to bear witness eternally. It implied an unraveling of his very being, a severing of his connection to everything he knew, everything that made him Dean. It was a fate worse than death. A slow, conscious dissolution into the very madness his grandfather had succumbed to. The island howled, not with the familiar shriek of a gale, but a sound like a vast, ancient throat tearing open, a raw, guttural moan that vibrated through the very stones of the cottage. Dean stood at the window, his breath frosting the pane, watching the maelstrom unfold. The fog, once a soft shroud, had curdled into a roiling, viscous mass, swirling with impossible speed, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the sea. And the sea itself, it was a black, churning chaos. Not merely waves breaking, but colossal, oily swells that defied the laws of physics, rising like bruised mountains before collapsing with concussive force. It was the entity's influence, a psychic tide that washed over everything, twisting perception, unraveling reality. The cottage groaned around him, timbers protesting, glass rattling a frantic rhythm. He wasn't just observing the storm, he was immersed in its malevolent hum, a discordant symphony of approaching doom. Outside, the island was no longer merely desolate, it was grotesque. Through gaps in the swirling vapor, he'd glimpsed the familiar, sturdy spruces along the coastline. Now, their branches clawed at the sky, not with the grace of living wood, but with the gnarled, arthritic contortions of something in profound pain. Their needles, once emerald, had taken on a pallid, gray-green hue, and in the unnatural light, they seemed to weep a dark, resinous sap that stained the rocks below. The very earth seemed to pulse, a slow, sickening beat beneath his worn boots, as if the island itself had developed a monstrous, hidden heart. The journal lay open on the rough-hewn table, its brittle pages illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. His grandfather's frantic script, once a mere enigma, now screamed with clarity. The threshold, the sacrifice of self, not blood, not a life, but the severing. Tavik on the eye, to bear witness eternally. Dean traced the words with a trembling finger. He understood. It wasn't about dying. It was about ceasing to be Dean, the cartographer, the man who grieved, the man who had loved. It was about becoming an empty vessel, a conduit, a perpetual sentinel for something unspeakable. The realization was a cold, sharp blade, slicing through the last vestiges of his hope for a normal life. Yet it also forged a grim resolve within him. He was terrified, yes, but he was also furiously, desperately determined. The journal detailed specific coordinates, a location far from the lighthouse on the island's northernmost tip, a research station. His grandfather had mentioned it in passing, a forgotten outpost for marine studies, abandoned decades ago. It was there, the journal implied, that the final steps of the counter-ritual could be enacted. It was there that the breach could be sealed, and the sacrifice made. Stepping out of the cottage was like plunging into a frigid, suffocating ocean. The wind tore at him, a physical force that sought to rip him from his feet. The air was thick with stinging spray and the acrid scent of decay, strangely mingled with the sharp tang of salt. He leaned into the gale, each step a battle, his head bowed against the onslaught. The path, once familiar, was now barely discernible, choked with warped vegetation. Twisted roots, thick as his forearm, snaked across the ground like grasping tendrils, their bark mottled with patches of phosphorescent moss that pulsed with a sickly green light. The tide was out, revealing the skeletal remains of what looked like a colossal fish, its bones picked clean. But these weren't ordinary bones. The sight fueled his urgency, solidifying the horror that had been building for weeks. The research station emerged from the swirling fog like a spectral wreck, a low concrete structure, half buried in the earth, its windows long shattered, gaping like vacant eyes. The rusted remains of scientific equipment lay scattered around the perimeter, corroded by salt and time. The wind whistled through the broken panes, creating a mournful, drawn-out cry that echoed the island's lament. The main laboratory, a large, open space, was filled with overturned tables and shattered glass. Dean pulled out the journal, flipping to the final pages. His grandfather had sketched a crude diagram, pointing to a specific spot within the observation chamber, a small, circular depression in the concrete floor. The locus, where the veils are thinnest, where the echo resonates. He also detailed specific items, a piece of polished obsidian, a coil of copper wire, and a small, lead-lined box. Dean had found them, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a false bottom of his grandfather's sea chest back at the cottage. He laid them out on a relatively clear section of a workbench, the obsidian catching the faint light with an unnerving depth. The counter-ritual wasn't elaborate in its physical components, but its implications were vast. The obsidian, the wire, the box, they were merely anchors, focal points for the true sacrifice, and at the precise moment of their utterance, the intent, the resolve to sever himself, had to be absolute. A sudden, jarring thud echoed from somewhere deeper within the research station, followed by a dragging sound, wet and heavy. Dean froze, his hand tightening around the journal. The entity wasn't merely influencing the island. It was here, stirring closer than ever. Its psychic pressure intensified, pressing in on him, making his thoughts cloudy, his resolve waver. He closed his eyes, forcing the images back, forcing his grandfather's words to the forefront of his mind. The price is steep, Dean, but the alternative is oblivion for us all. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic tang of the air filling his lungs. The time for hesitation was over. He was ready, or as ready as he could ever be. The island howled, a sound Dean now understood as a vast, ancient throat tearing open, a raw, guttural moan that vibrated through the very stones of the cottage. He stood at the window, his breath frosting the pane, watching the maelstrom unfold. But the true storm was not in the sky. It was beneath, within the very heart of the island. He clutched the heavy, barnacle-encrusted key his grandfather had left behind, its cold metal a grounding weight in his trembling hand. This was it, the final descent. He moved through the churning chaos of the lighthouse, the beam above sweeping wildly, cutting through the spectral tendrils of fog that now seemed to writhe with an unnatural life. The air grew thick, humid with a saline decay, and his ears popped with an unseen pressure. The familiar scent of brine and old stone warped into something else, a metallic, cloying odor like rusted blood and stagnant tide pools. He found the hidden door, a heavy iron plate disguised within the lighthouse's base, long forgotten and now growing open with a shriek that echoed the island's own agony. Beyond it, a spiral staircase, slick with condensation, plunged into the bedrock. He descended, the air growing colder, heavier, until he emerged into a vast, cavernous space cavern deep beneath the lighthouse. This was it, the research station. It wasn't sterile or modern, but a forgotten, primordial chamber, its walls slick with black-green lichen, ancient instruments rusted into grotesque sculptures. A circular pool of murky, phosphorescent water dominated the center, glowing with an internal, sickening light. It was a wound in the earth, a direct conduit to the abyssal domain. The entity was here fully manifested not as a creature of flesh and bone, but as a distortion in the very fabric of reality. A low, resonant thrum filled the cavern, vibrating in his teeth, his bones, his very soul. From the murky depths of the pool, grotesque forms pulsed, not quite solid, not quite liquid, amorphous shapes that writhed and stretched, like vast, unseen organs contracting. His mind recoiled, a primal scream caught in his throat. Dean forced himself forward, his gaze fixed on the ancient stone altar at the pool's edge. He carried his grandfather's journal, its pages brittle, along with the other artifacts he had painstakingly gathered, a shard of obsidian, a twisted piece of petrified wood, and a small, rusted anchor-shaped amulet. He laid them out, his hands shaking so violently the obsidian clattered. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and vast, echoing with the despair of forgotten ages. Join us! The entity sought his despair, feeding on it, twisting it into a seductive offer of oblivion. This was the psychological assault, the relentless gnawing at his sanity. He gripped the obsidian shard, its sharp edge biting into his palm, the physical pain a lifeline back to the present. No, Dean rasped, his voice a pathetic squeak against the entity's roar. This wasn't just about his grief, it was about protecting what remained. He began the ritual, his grandfather's scrawled symbols and instructions his only guide. He poured the black-green liquid from a small vial onto the altar, its foul smell momentarily overpowering the decay. As he traced the ancient glyphs with his finger, the very ground beneath him bucked. Stalactites, sharp as teeth, rained down from the cavern ceiling, narrowly missing his head. The pool's waters surged, splashing over the altar, threatening to extinguish the ritual. This was the physical attack, the environment itself becoming an extension of the entity's fury. He chanted the words from the journal, a guttural language that felt alien on his tongue, yet flowed with an unsettling familiarity. Each syllable was a struggle, met with a surge of pressure that threatened to crush his lungs. His vision swam, and the cavern wall seemed to melt and reform, revealing fleeting glimpses of colossal, tentacled horrors that pulsed with an internal, sickly light. He was losing himself, the edges of his mind fraying. The final step, the journal spoke of a binding, a sacrifice to complete the seal. Dean looked at the last, unadorned artifact, a simple, smooth stone, worn by countless tides that had belonged to his lost loved one. It was all he had left, the last tangible link to his past, to the tragedy that still haunted him. He understood now. With a profound, agonizing wrench, Dean placed the stone on the altar, directly into the glowing pool of liquid. The thrumming intensified into a deafening roar. He felt a tearing sensation, not in his flesh, but in the very core of his being, as if a part of his soul was being ripped away, absorbed by the hungry maw. He stumbled back, gasping, as the vortex began to recede, the black waters settling, the phosphorescence fading. The entity was sealed, the portal closed. But Dean stood amidst the shattered remnants of the research station, physically exhausted, mentally scarred, and profoundly, irrevocably changed. The island was safe for now. The light, a blinding spear forged from desperate will and ancient mechanics, erupted from the heart of the lighthouse. Dean had twisted the massive brass wheel until his knuckles screamed, aligning the grandfather's cryptic sigil, etched onto a forgotten lens with the churning maw of the encroaching blackness. He hadn't understood the precise mechanics, only that the symbols in the old journal, combined with the lighthouse's focused beam, were his only recourse. A guttural roar, not of sound but a pure, crushing pressure against his mind, had answered the light. He felt himself torn and stretched, on the verge of being unraveled into the abyssal void, but he held on, gritting his teeth, channeling every ounce of his grief and fury into the blinding pulse. Then silence. The crushing weight lifted, leaving behind a profound emptiness that echoed the one within him. The air in the lantern room, thick moments before with the stench of brine and something unimaginably ancient, now merely smelled of ozone and stale sea air. His body ached, a deep, pervasive soreness that spoke of more than just physical exertion. He felt stretched, then, as if the boundary between himself and the vast, indifferent ocean had blurred, perhaps permanently. He looked out at the pre-dawn gloom, the fog a shroud over the waves. He was still here. He had survived, but the cost was yet to be fully tallied. He had to understand what he had done, what he had become. The trek across the island was a blur of slick rock and grasping heather. The fog, usually a comforting veil, now felt like a deliberate obscuration, pressing in, damp and heavy, muffling the already muted roar of the ocean. Each step felt deliberate, yet detached, as if he were watching himself move through a dream. The gulls cried overhead, their calls sharper, more insistent than usual, like warnings. He could feel the island beneath his worn boots, a tremor, a pulse that seemed to mirror the one now thrumming within him. He found the research station tucked into a low-lying cove on the island's eastern side, almost swallowed by the encroaching land and sea. It was a squat concrete structure, long abandoned, its windows boarded over, its corrugated iron roof rusted to a sickly orange. It looked like a forgotten scar on the rugged landscape, a stark contrast to the natural beauty he had once sought. The air here was heavy with the smell of decay, of salty metal and damp earth. A thin, reedy whistle of wind snaked through a broken pane somewhere high up, a mournful lament. He fumbled for the lantern he had instinctively brought from the lighthouse, its beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The interior was a jumble of ruined equipment, rusted microscopes, corroded chemical beakers, charts flaking from damp walls. The floor was gritty with sand and salt, punctuated by puddles of stagnant water. Then he saw it, illuminated by his trembling light. A reinforced desk in the center of the main room, strangely preserved, covered in a waterproof tarp that his grandfather must have placed. Beneath it, a stack of bound journals far more numerous and detailed than the ones he'd found in the cottage. He pulled the tarp away, the plastic crackling like dry bones. His grandfather's familiar, precise script filled page after page, but these entries were different. They weren't just observations. They were confessions, scientific notations intertwined with desperate warnings. Dean's eye scanned the cramped lines, the words blurring, then snapping into terrible focus. The pact was never broken, only maintained. The deep song is not defeated, merely contained. And the keeper is the lock, the conduit. He traced a finger over a diagram, a complex geometric pattern that mirrored the sigil he had etched onto the lighthouse lens. Below it, his grandfather had scrawled, "Each act of binding strengthens the connection, not just to the cage, but to the source of the deep song. The knowledge becomes part of you. You hear it, always. You feel its pull, its hunger, but you also feel the responsibility of its containment." The reveal was a hammer blow to his already fragile mind. He hadn't defeated the entity, he had become its sentinel. The deep song was still there, but now it hummed within him, a low, constant frequency beneath the surface of his thoughts, a terrible, intimate presence. Instead, it was fundamentally altered, expanded to encompass a reality no human mind was meant to bear. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer seeking solace. He looked around the desolate research station, then back at the journals, his grandfather's final legacy. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes, but at the cost of his very self. He was trapped on this island, not by chains, but by an invisible, terrible pact. The future was not one of escape, but of an unsettling, eternal vigilance. He was the lock, and the deep was always listening.